I'm Scott Lucas. This is today's EAWorldView on the Middle East, from Syria to Iraq to Bahrain. How to disappear protesters. Shout sectarian. Last weekend, the New York Times published a lengthy piece by one of its veteran journalists, Middle East correspondent David Kirkpatrick, and it started with this provocative headline: Power struggles in the Middle East exploit Islam's ancient sectarian rift. There you have it, folks. All the events of the last few years in the Arab Spring or the events that occurred afterwards are just simply sectarianism. Protests have disappeared. Demands for rights and reform have been overwhelmed. How could this be so? Kirkpatrick goes to Bahrain, a country where there were uprisings in February 2011, mass protest calling for rights and reforms from the largely Sunni monarchy. There were lots of Shia Muslims in this protest, but there were lots of Sunni Muslims as well. After all, these were hundreds of thousands of people on an island of only a few million. Yet within weeks, those protests had been crushed, forcibly, by police and security forces from Bahrain, backed up by Saudi intervention. Many people were detained, others disappeared, scores were killed. Bahrain's human rights activists, such as Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja, such as Nabil Rajab, would serve prison sentences ranging from 2 years to a lifetime, as the kingdom tried to make sure that the protests could not recur. David Kirkpatrick walks into Bahrain in 2014 and tells us that indeed, this is an island where all that is left is Shia versus Sunni. All that is left is the kingdom, which he says has been repressive at times, versus a Shia majority who he not only insinuates but says openly is in danger of being manipulated by Iran. Really? Kirkpatrick actually talks to very few people inside Bahrain in producing this story. When he does quote members of the opposition, he actually takes their words out of context. They don't say this is now sectarian conflict. They say that they are continuing the fight because they don't believe it is sectarian. They believe that it only becomes sectarian when the repression continues. But at the end of the day, Kirkpatrick isn't interested in repression. When he talks about the protest suddenly disappearing in 2011, he only briefly mentions that Saudi forces came into the country. He doesn't talk about the sustained brutality that was carried out by the regime. So there's a double disappearance. The original protesters, some of whom died, many of whom went to prison, are now gone. And 3 years later, the moderate opposition, the opposition that does not believe in a sectarian future for Bahrain, is also gone. They have disappeared. And so, by the way, have protesters and those who want change in Iraq or in Syria. Because what Kirkpatrick does is he uses Bahrain as an example of what is supposedly happening across the Middle East. In Iraq, it is the Sunnis who are trying to overthrow the Shia government in Baghdad. In Syria, it is the Sunnis who are fighting against the Assad regime. He ignores the fact that there have been groups who are not Sunni, who are Shia, who are Christian, who are Turkoman, who have actually been part of the attempt to change those governments. It's a dangerous narrative, but it's a convenient one. Because if you want to walk away from the Middle East, if it's just too difficult, you just say, they're always going to fight because they've always been sectarian. They've always been trying to kill each other. I know this because this is what my relatives have told me in the United States, not just for the last 3 years, but for decades. Why are we getting involved? It will only end up in the apocalypse anyway. They only want to kill each other. But it's one thing hearing it from my relatives. It's a much different thing hearing it from the New York Times. I'm Scott Lucas, and this has been today's EA Worldview on the Middle East, from Syria to Iraq to Bahrain.